What's up, though?
Glad to be with you, man.
This is gonna be a fun one. This is gonna be spicy.
Yes.
That's really cool to hear. But who's number one? What is that? Is he Mormon? Well, he's either that or a Greek philosopher, man. I mean, come on, that name. By like how much is he number one if we're number two? Okay. Well, let me hold on.
Steven.
Let me know when we're about to go live.
Steven.
Okay, by how?
We're live.
Hold on. Wait, hold on, Carlos. What?
We're live.
Hey, I gotta go, buddy. All right. Thank you. All right, we'll edit this out.
Yeah. We'll just edit out of the live stream.
All right, we got to cut this now too, Matthew. Welcome to the King Pill Show with Stevie Boy and co-host Matthew. Not for nothing, guys, but and of course you see Tho Bishop here, so
Chad Bishop,
Tho Bishop,
also known as
before
Tho.
we get started, let's why don't we? This has nothing to do with anything that we may have edited out, but let's head on over to palomaverdecbd.com and be sure to use promo code KING. That's promo code KING to save 25%. And certainly not promo code Greek philosopher name, Mormon Greek philosopher name. That's not the promo code that we want to use, fans. I'm not going to say who's out competing us in this Paloma Verde sponsorship. I will say that we're number two. I will say also that Andrew is not the name of a Greek philosopher. And I'll also add that if it turns out that it is the name of a Greek philosopher, I don't want to hear about it. But what I do want you to do is head over to palomaverdecbd.com and use promo code KING to save 25% on your order of fantastic CBD products provided to us by Carlos and Vanessa Abelar.
Are you a consumptor of CBD though?
I am not, but after that sales pitch there, I'm gonna go put my order in, get my 25% off.
There we go.
We've got to up these numbers. We're doing great, but unfortunately, they're not rookie numbers, but they're not number one numbers. And over here at the KP, we're looking for number one kind of numbers.
Absolutely, always.
We're like the young guy who he was really highly touted coming out of college, and he went 8th overall, and everyone's got a lot of high expectations, and he hasn't been bad, but it's kind of like 550 yards and 4 touchdowns just doesn't quite cut it. And
it's not sexy, Phil. We're looking for sexy.
Right. Yeah.
You don't want to be the Ted Ginn. You want to be Terrell Owens.
Yeah. There you go. There's a good reference.
All right. Always wanted to be Terrell Owens, by the way.
He's remember the Sharpie incident?
Absolutely. I was watching I had a random YouTube video pop up of the whole controversy where they had the crossover with Desperate Housewives, and it was T.O. and one of their actresses naked as the promo thing, and how this was a big culture war battle back then. This was the golden days when the NFL was actually fun.
Right. That's wild to think about, and it changed so fast.
Yeah.
So fast. I saw a guy tweeted the other day. I disagree with him, so I won't say who it was. But because I'm trying to be, as I said before we went live, I told the guys that I'm trying to be provocative but not confrontational. So he said that as soon as the NFL told him that they hated him, he stopped listening, and he was like, "It's that easy. I don't know why everyone's having such a hard problem." And I haven't been able to make myself do it yet. It's I know that they hate me, but if I was not consuming the content, I would miss it. So then I'm only owning myself by boycotting it. So I'm whatever, they hate me. And it's not like whether or not I tune in is going to be the difference. And so this is why it's the banality of evil. It's people are just meh. And collectively that shrug turns into genocide.
Well, one of the things that's bailed at the NFL is that it's such a great gambling sport. Fantasy football. Fantasy football is the best football because it's the best fantasy sport because it's so weekly sort of driven. If you didn't have the rise of fantasy football and gaming just generally, I think the NFL would be in a much harder situation because of that stuff. But I know my vices there keep me tuning in no matter how big the end the racism banners are. Latinx celebration month or whatever they've got going on. I'll as long as I can still make money on a 14 parlay and have a good weekend. That'll keep me tuning in.
And really, it's gotten to the point where football is just a pretext for the gambling. That's what you're touching on. That if it wasn't for the gambling aspect of it, then football wouldn't honestly, it probably would have been catastrophic for them to the angle that they took. So now
then you go like the whole game theory of football. Like there's also interesting like Messian and sort of insights that go into that. Like it's that once that's the only thing keeping you up, right? Like so the Shield is doing everything it can to diminish a great American institution.
Very much so. Yeah, it's as American as football. It's funny as I've kind of started losing interest in football to a degree. I haven't lost interest in it completely, but to a degree. And I really only watch it just for the sake of fantasy, of daily fantasy. That's the biggest point of interest for me. But the sport that I've started watching a lot more is soccer. So I've really gotten into soccer from marrying Amy. She was a huge LA Galaxy fan. She's been an LA Galaxy fan since the team began to exist. And so she got me into it. And now it's basically, I watch the NFL typically, but I kind of watch it with one eye. Whereas when there's a Galaxy game on, I sit down and I watch it. And that's become my new sport. And it's funny because I used to be the guy who was like, I was the football fan. And I like talked about how like soccer fans or soccer players are divas and all that kind of thing. But man, once I started actually watching the sport, they're easily the best athletes in sports. And you can't just be a good athlete. The average soccer player is much higher IQ than the average football player. Because for the football player, it's really just memorizing. It's like memorizing specific steps and then just kind of having to adapt them sort of in real time. Whereas soccer, you're essentially inventing the game as you go. So you have to have a really great like spatial awareness, and you have to be able to do like multi-chain reasoning and improvising on the fly. And so that's for me, that's what keeps me into sports, is watching it on that basis.
Matthew,
so I'll be very sad when I have to
channel nuked. I left last episode. He starts talking about the bankers that run society, and we're here with football.
Tho doesn't know anything about bankers.
Oh gosh. Let's try to keep it between the lines, shall we, Matthew?
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Just so you know, guys, you can join our supporting listeners group where you can get access to these sorts of conversations and more. Lately in the group there, we've been on a big binge of people doing the Jungian cognitive function analysis, and which is the thing that Myers-Briggs, or that the MBTI thing is a watered down perversion of. We've been actually really getting into that, and people have been typing themselves and learning a whole lot about themselves, and they've been surprised at how accurate this is in terms of it's like describing the way that your cognition functions and how you perceive information and then how you process that information. And it's been very informative for all of us. So we've had a great conversation going on there about that recently. Pretty soon here, as soon as we get through a few events here, we're going to be doing a live Zoom call with some of our supporting listeners, those who are at the top tier. I think we're going to be talking about orthodoxy, and we've got at least one Reformed guy. We've got a couple Catholics. We've got some. I think we have some like a couple catechumens maybe, and then there's a wide range of people in there, and we'll have a pretty good conversation. So if you guys want to join, it's subscribestar.com/kingpilled, and that's where you got 3 different options, and we'd be happy to have you join our group with us. And then the last thing is it says we got 16 people watching right now, and we have 0 thumbs down. That's unacceptable. That is absolutely unacceptable. Those are rookie numbers. You guys need to get those numbers up. There's 17 of you watching. I expect far more thumbs down than we currently have. So get on your game, folks. We'll sit here and we'll rattle off words and talk ourselves to death. You guys have to do your part. There we go. There's one. Someone's like thumbs upping it too. That's not acceptable. There we go. Another thumbs down. There we go. All right. Good job, guys. We appreciate you. Thank you for doing your part. So before we really get into the meat of the Mises stuff here today, I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, Tho. A couple of different headlines I saw here, and let's see. So you're the Florida guy. For those who don't know, you're a proud citizen of the great country of Florida.
Yes, absolutely.
And the great country of Florida is currently led by a Chad himself, Ron DeSantis. And I saw this headline the other day. It said, Florida to investigate Facebook over election laws. And I saw this headline, and I really liked this headline. Now, I know that most libertarians would see that headline, and they would like you read that headline, and there's basically two sides here. There's Florida and there's Facebook, and I think that this is a great this is a really great test to determine where you're, I guess maybe where you fall on the political spectrum. If you read Florida to investigate Facebook over election laws, and you naturally sympathize with Facebook, that says a lot about you. If you're someone who reads that and naturally sympathizes with Florida, that also says a lot about you. So the thing that was related to it is I just saw another one that came through here today that said Russia threatens to block YouTube nationwide. Eyes measures against Deutsche Welle after YouTube took down RT's German language channels. Kremlin urges zero tolerance. So this is a thing that several years ago, a few years ago even, I would have been very much. I would have seen this as, oh, that's, tyranny. How dare the state step in and interfere in the market? Like, I love my YouTube channel. I love my Facebook page. I want to be able to use these, and the state shouldn't have anything to do with me using them. My position on that has definitely evolved, and I have a different take now. But what is your take on that? How do you respond to this when you see it?
Well, I do think, for one, like I've, like yourself, my position on this has changed over time. A few years ago, I would have had that same exact sort of reaction. And I do have some sympathy, because one of the issues with the big tech things as a general issue is that, much like any sort of important thing, there's some certain people that take the question too far or will engage with it in a dangerous way. And so, for example, a lot of the conversation about social media in general is kind of on 230 regulation and what we've done at the federal level. I think that leads itself to a whole other mess of problems, and the idea that the federal government's going to actually end up increasing the realms of dissident thought out there is not the way the fairness doctrine worked. There's a long pattern of this. When it comes to Florida, though, for one, I just recognize that whether it's Florida or a lot of other countries at this point, Facebook has more power than they do, in spite of the fact that Florida is the government involved. The second thing, though, is that there's an aspect here that I think often gets overlooked, which is we've always treated, in a democracy, political speech differently, right? Because there's the recognition that, and again, right or wrong, whatever, you can have libertarian arguments about this, fine, but in a libertarian world, you don't have elections that dictate power, so that's why these things, I kind of dismiss. Because when you have the levers of power being dictated by the decisions and votes of the masses, however part of the population it is, the ability to control that flow of information has a direct consequence on who wields power. And so on the national scale, we have already regulated traditional media in ways of creating that sort of town square sort of aspect that people will roll their eyes with when people talk about it in reference to Facebook and Twitter, right? If you are a newspaper, if you are a radio station, if you are a cable news network, if you're a network news network, and you take campaign advertising dollars from one side, you must take them from the other side. If you give free time to one side, you must give it to the other side, right? Because again, we've recognized that this stuff has a direct outcome in the political environment. And so all the Florida approach did, and so you have this investigation. This kind of just, some of this is just throwing out press headlines out there, but there's a general trend from Florida between the legislation that got passed and is currently being held up in federal courts between this stuff, where I think what it shows is you have some people like the Laura Loomis of the world that will criticize Florida to say that we're not doing enough on this issue. Instead, what I see this as a very surgical attempt here to identify the way that Facebook has manipulated political language in ways that go against longstanding political legal norms in the country. And I think those arguments could be very persuasive in a court of law, which ultimately this is all going to end up itself in. And so I'm very open to this. And I think an example of it, like one of the aspects, again, going back to the legislative aspect, there's kind of three big dynamics there. One is that you had a platform, registered political candidates, so getting away from that equal time thing. You had social media platforms had to be transparent with their policies. And the third was that customers could sue for arbitrary enforcement of these policies if they thought they were dictated by a political lens. And so, for example, I'm here in Florida. I would have been eligible for this rule. A few months ago, later on, last month, I was kicked off of my page for 3 days because I shared a Hunter Biden link. It was about a laptop video and a sex tape on it. It was flagged for abusive sexual content The publisher of that piece was the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail's page was not punished, right? I think they took down the article from the site, whatever. But it's literally one of those platforms that has the little check mark on Facebook, right? And so this was at a Facebook-approved platform that I just simply shared a link from them. It is flagged, obviously, for political reasons. And I'm now unable to use Facebook ads for 60 days when I do, among other things, social media management, which directly, so I actually have, I've spent thousands of dollars in the past building up a business relationship with them. I've got ways where my job depends upon it. I can prove economic damage from this arbitrary politicized enforcement thing. And I'm sorry, I think me as a consumer, I think I have a right here where this company is acting in bad faith for an explicitly political intent. And that's where, again, I don't think this can simply be, yada away by trying to make Facebook into a wall that some people graffiti on, and the government trying to say, oh, well, you can't cover up that graffiti. Like, if that's the sort of, again, that's Fee published this sort of argument. When libertarians fall in the example of they have to so distort what Facebook is in the modern world to make their point, they're highlighting how unserious their position really is. And again, if you actually care about, again, using liberal society in the Misesian sense, if you care about a liberal society, you need to be worried about these illiberal actors, the amount of power they've been given. And then, of course, there's that additional side point of the degree to which large corporations have benefited directly from protectionist policies from the regulatory side of things, subsidizing their debt, which has led for them to acquire your rivals and things like that. So again, you're dealing with more potent, consolidated corporate actors because of all this state policy in general. And so again, the free market's going to take care of this sort of thing. Oh, just don't use Facebook. Like, that doesn't work, particularly in the political side of things. Because again, you might be able to be creative in other outlets like Odyssey, and those are wonderful things. Again, God bless everyone doing alternative platforms. If you're trying to get your message to the masses, well, your boomer the grandma is not going to go on, 4chan to avoid censorship, right? And so, like, you're when we're dealing with politics of persuading the masses, like, this is a side of things. And again, in a libertarian sphere, you wouldn't have the political dynamic at all in the first place to be worried about. So, I agree with you on that, and that's kind of, again, and I've been very impressed by the Desantis' approach, because it's not as big as some people want, but I think it's very surgical in a way that matters.
Right. Yeah, so, man, that was a fantastic answer.
Yeah, it was really good. We've established that Though has no principles. So imagine that Matthew had a second question.
Well, I was gonna say that there's a sense. So basically, it's kind of like there's a class action case against Florida, and DeSantis, his administration, is serving as the political representation for that, because so he's using his power to promote the interests of the people who are being harmed by this distortion of a natural hierarchy and of natural human relationships, with Facebook's activities being it's even like if they don't meet some standard of fraud or abuse of some kind that exists in legislation currently, then it should, because it's not like the internet is going away. It's not like major tech companies and major tech platforms are going away, are going to disappear. It's not like a democratic system is going to suddenly stop following the sentiments of the masses as they're conditioned and impressed upon by those who control all the communication media. That's never going to happen. So there's this, like Beacon Jonas talks about, living in Ancapistan in your head. We agree that in a Ancapistan where every single person was an ANCAP and was wholly dedicated, sworn to this religion and going to participate in this set of behaviors, then yeah, we wouldn't want to have a state organization that has to step in a case like we agree, but that's not the world that we live in. We don't have a world like that, and we're not going to have a world like that. Ultimately, your position has to be judged on its actual impact, its actual consequences. If you apply the standard libertarian dogma to this situation, you don't wind up in a world with more liberty, you wind up in a world with less. And that's not to say that there's no danger or that there's no potential cost to having a DeSantis administration accord this kind of power to themselves. Of course, there's risks. There's always going to be risks because there's always going to be power, and there's always going to be people using that power for one reason or another. So what we want is people using their power to do things that we like. That's the fact of the matter, because that's ultimately how every society is formed and functioned and governed.
Right. So, absolutely, and think about really what has put let's say like the grassroots conservative rather than like the Republican politicians. But what has so moved conservative America, which are, again, historically been the defenders of corporations, right? The reason why is because they saw very vividly the way that these corporations treated not only themselves, but also Donald Trump, who they see as a leader who has delivered for them. And if they can do that to someone that powerful, then what can they do to the rest of us? And so the reason why these sort of realignment happens when you have large figures that the people trust to move them in ways that are against their normal character, and like we can complain about it or not, but like Trump has that position within the right, DeSantis has that position within Florida, I think larger, and so that also goes to be said that yes, the power can always be wielded in very, very dangerous ways, which is why. But it's always wielded by powerful people, and so what you need is to have powerful people on your side, rather than doing everything you can to make sure that none of your people can ever be powerful.
Right.
Because there's no other way. Like this is the classic liberal problem: is that they always want to divorce power from human judgment, and so they think, oh, if we create a constitution, then we can eliminate then we can eliminate the need of angels, right? If we can create legal presidents, then it will always reach. And the problem is it doesn't work that way. Like, you may not need angels for a good government, but you need people that want to be angels. Because if you're simply governed by people that have no such aspirations, they're going to find the way to break down any system they want in order to get their way. And so we need people prepared with the right ideas to hold the sword when necessary.
Yeah.
And there's no other way of getting around that.
Is there any particular passage or writing that sort of summarizes that idea that you might want to share with the class potentially?
Well, there is one on terms of the importance for libertarians to deal with reality as it is, because like one of the things about Mises that I think is interesting, and I think I love Murray Rothbard to death. I consider myself a Rothbardian. Like I'm when I draw these comparisons, I not do so in a critical way. There are some areas where I agree with Rothbard more than Mises. But I think there is an aspect, and part of this I think is it's a credit to Rothbard himself. Rothbard completely transformed the political side of the Austrian school with his anarchism, right? Because you have this very market-driven form of governance. Like it appeals to a lot of libertarian notions which were coming up in the 70s, right? And so a lot of when we think about Austrian economics from a political scale, we're usually thinking about Rothbardianism in some sort of form, left, right, whatever. Maybe it's just a vulgar form of the mix in the middle, but it's usually kind of that, rather than Mises, because like Mises was not like Rothbard was this sort of Randian, we're driven by natural law and this kind of almost kind of heroic sort of view of things, whereas Mises was a consequentialist in his own, a utilitarian in his own sort of sense. He was a lot less sort of idealistic in a lot of this. And when you see him actually write about the use of political power, he's far less radical than Rothbard. He never considered himself an anarchist. He hated the anarchists. Part of that has to do with experience in Europe rather than the Rothbardians. So he's got a fascinating article that is kind of one of those overlooks things. It's in one of the Ebeling collections that came about after he found Mises's writings when he traveled to Russia. Some of these were confiscated by the Nazis. Interesting story in its own right. But in this one, he's trying to establish what an Eastern Democratic Union would look like for a durable peace after World War II. And he's talking about, Eastern Europe keeps getting Europe into war. There's a lot of people that, there's some liberals that, want to believe that in a world of free trade, he says, free trade and democracy, no special institutions, provisions are needed in order to ensure undisturbed peaceful cooperation. In such a world, yada, 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 it'd be great. But our world is very different from this liberal free trade utopia. We are living in an age where governments are eager to further the short-sighted interests of certain groups of citizens at the expense of other groups of citizens and of foreigners. Ours is an age of economic nationalism. Such is the stark reality we have to face. We should not deceive ourselves by false illusions. All arguments brought forward in order to demonstrate the disadvantage of warfare and the benefits of undisturbed peace are in vain in an age of economic nationalism. So we can't simply appeal to these sort of lofty, ideologically pure sort of things. We have to deal with the fact that the world exists as it is now. And when we try to design institutions to bring us closer to a peaceful, more prosperous age that respects property rights and the like, we can't build from Ancapistan in our heads. We have to take it from this interventionist world that we're living in. And unfortunately, there's so many, I think this is the sort of mindset that so many libertarians retreat to, rather than dealing with the nasty realities of this mixed economy that we get to enjoy the fruits of. But yeah, I think that was the quote that you were...
Yeah, that's actually the one that I was thinking of too, though. Just sort of a couple men of similar ilk.
Yes.
Just sort of thinking of the same piece of Mises writing. Carry on, Matthew. Matthew, are you muted, sir? Act like you've done this.
Yeah, my bad.
Please. Thank you.
Rookie
Jason,
move.
Mr. Stapleton, I'm out here if you need somebody. All right.
In this, what were we talking about? We're talking about
Marx, I think was no.
Yeah. What was the point? What was the point you guys just finished talking about? That
dealing with the world as it exists politically.
Dealing with the world as it exists.
Seems like a nice time to talk about our sponsor for the day, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. So if you want to not smoke marijuana during your podcast with your first guest that anyone would actually watch, what you can do is enjoy some strawberry lemonade gummies from PalomaVerdeCBD.com and use promo code KING to save 25%. All right, there we go.
That was slick. That was very, very well done. So in dealing with the world as it is, there's a tendency by the libertarian community to instead of viewing the world as it actually is and operating according to its existing principles, they abstract it away. They take it up into this nether region where they kind of imagine that we live in Ancapistan, and they begin operating within that world. Mm-hmm. The way that they operate within that world is as a liberal, with the belief that you can legislate your way to utopia. In this particular case, the legislation that they're thinking of is like an unspoken legislation where everybody is all legally committed to the same principle of we're all going to respect each other's property rights. Right. Property rights are not, the libertarian conception of property rights is not self-evident to everybody. It's a very small minority of people who actually believe in property rights in that sense. And property rights are necessarily a system of consensus, or consensus is a key component of it. If everybody else has a consensus that this is not your property, then it's likely not going to be your property anymore. And that's just the reality of things. So ultimately there's a subjectivity to property, and libertarians, they are, the water that they swim in that they don't recognize is water, is liberalism. They're part of the liberal ideal, which ultimately sees man as an economic unit that can be plugged into a machine and programmed to create a utopia. So they're not a divergence from liberalism. They're just an application of it. And all applications of liberalism wind up in the same place. They wind up at the technocracy, at the panopticon. That's the inevitability of the liberal system. So this is the way that you, I think, can tell when you're operating according to this mindset and when you aren't, is if you aren't actually paying attention to the consequences of the actions that you take. And did those actions move you toward your conception of liberty, or did they move you away from it? And ultimately, that's going to be an individual question. That's going to be a matter. That's why we have the wealth, power, and influence message, because ultimately, the first place where you can begin to experience that move toward liberty is in your own life. Once you've experienced it in your own life, you know what it looks like, and then you know how to look for it on the larger scale. So, but it starts with, as you're saying, as Mises is saying, that you can't build on a foundation that doesn't exist. The foundation of Ancapistan doesn't exist. You can't build on that foundation. You have to build on the foundation of the existing state as it is now, and you have to understand the network of incentives within that state so that you can program it to try to spit out whatever result that you're wanting.
No, that's absolutely, and I think one of the parts of that is that, and I mean, you know, once upon a time, I mean, this used to be the go-to saying of a certain type of libertarian was that they'd call it, you know, low-tax liberalism, right? Mm-hmm. And there's always been, and this goes to the cultural aspects of it, where you have a lot of libertarians that believe that, you know, a lot of these non-legal concerns, such as language, religion, culture, etc., that all of these are archaic, you know, restraints on economic efficiency, right? And so that the best way to organize the world would be to transcend all of these biases and these cultural norms and to shake it all up. And so you have, everything's diverse and everything's kind of, you know, broken out based off of, you know, economic skill sets and whatever. And like, that would be the ideal world. And our GDP would go through the roof and that sort of stuff. And there's a lot of people that buy into that assumption, even if they don't really take it that far, right? It's just kind of the notion that, oh, well, liberalism is tolerance, right? Or libertarianism is the best way of achieving a tolerant world, or a, and the problem is and Mises points this out a lot, is he focuses a lot on the differences between linguistic groups, because again, being a product of the Habsburg Empire, and there's a big issue there. You know, he deals with religious differences, nationalistic differences, and so he recognizes, and it's interesting that within that document that I quoted, his plan on, like, hey, look, if this is, he admits at the end, like, this is politically unpalatable, but if your top priority actually was to create peace in Eastern Europe that has given us so much trouble and has plagued the world in a war, then what you would do is that you would create a supernatural liberal order that would take away the governing powers in these nationalities and allow for the borders of these people to be driven by these organic national, organic might be the word, but these natural nationalistic aspects for it. Because what you would do is you would take away the interventionist tools where that pit politically one side against the other, right? And because, like, throughout his writings, he talks about, like, the biggest threat in a peaceful outside of war is being a political minority within a state that has an interventionist government, because it doesn't matter the justifications they use. Oh, well, it's illegal to ban against religion, but we're going to treat the buildings of X religion from a different code. Or it's illegal to discriminate against conservatives, but we're going to ban people that don't have vaccines, right? You know, there's all different ways the government can do where, like, they're punishing minority groups, you know, and it's like, so you either remove the interventionism from the economy and impose it on these people because they do not have that organic respect for property rights. You're not going to persuade them intellectually within this, or you have to have this intellectual bottom-up revolution that will, because the reality is that this other position is not going to withstand politically because the politicians can't understand it anyway. And so again, he gets in, like, so he's willing to say, look, like, the only way you're not going to have liberal order arise spontaneously, from the market, from market process and all that sort of stuff. It's going to be imposed. And that's why I think there's a lot of very interesting, I think a lot of critiques of Mises and I get why they go after libertarians generally, and Rothbard, and like early Rothbard, I think opens himself up to some of these critiques, but like Mises himself very much is that man of the old Europe right. And again, he is not he is very different in so many ways of like that 1970s American libertarian movement that we so think of. And the problem is that so many libertarians, they don't really care about Mises the man or the intricacies of views. They'll post a meme of Mises rather than read a 900-page book of Mises. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Every single political group does this. Every sort of people, you have your icons that you live up, and like their icons more important than their actual ideas, and yada yada yada. The difference is, though, is that a lot of libertarians will think that they're smarter than your democratic socialist sharing a Noam Chomsky meme because they're sharing a Mises meme, and Mises is obviously smarter because he's a libertarian. And it's like, I mean, he is like, don't get me wrong, he's right about that, but you don't really get like your understanding of what Mises is whatever your definition of libertarianism is. It's not really Mises the man and all the little nuance that goes into it.
Yeah, that's what I think you said something about it just before we started about that. It's like you rather than reading and educating yourself so that you can come to the conclusions that reading it should take you to, people are going into it with their conclusions and looking for anything that will flesh out those conclusions and give them a justification in holding those conclusions and believing them. And one of these is intellectually honest and the other one's not. And it's not that you're a bad person if you're doing the other one. It's that you're just normal. You're just like any other. You're like the vast majority of people. So you can't consider yourself special if that's the way that you're approaching it. Right.
And again, we have a lot of great historians at the Institute that write their histories from a libertarian perspective. I'm Rothbard, but you always have a perspective. You can never create a value-free history, right?
Yes.
This is not a criticism of any of that. And the great scholars, the Tom Woodses, the Chris Caltons, I mean, their understanding of history is much more nuanced than a lot of libertarians would want it to be. But there is always this trajectory is, white hat Thomas Jefferson, black hat, Alexander Hamilton. Everyone's hero and villain, and there's no room for nuance. And the problem is that just not the way, you dive into this stuff, and it's just like, no, there's a lot that you can learn from Alexander Hamilton. There's a lot you can learn from Aaron Burr. Like there's a lot that you can learn from your enemies. And again, if you're looking for wisdom, that's great. But again, I always think of like I think it's credited to Eleanor Roosevelt or something like that. But it's quite about average minds talk about people, good minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas. And the problem, and so a lot of people think they're talking about ideas because they think they're a great mind, but they're really not. It's great to talk about events. Like it makes you a midwit, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like as long as you know your limitations. But ultimately, though, what you really need though is those great people, because the masses are going to be moved by people. And so when ideas are at their most potent when they're embodied in an individual.
Yeah.
And there's no way of separating that. Like Martin Van Buren may have been the brains behind Jacksonianism, but he could only have power on the American system because he had Andrew fucking Jackson, right? Like that's and it fell apart when he was replaced with Martin Van Buren, right? Like you have to have the man, and you can use the man as the vehicle to type the average minds. And again, it's just so I don't know how we got on that tangent, but
what you're illustrating. Let me just say this real quick, Steve. What you're illustrating is that they are like they want to persuade people, right. and you're saying this is how you persuade people.
Yes.
This is the way that people are wired, and this is how you can capitalize on that.
You're not going to persuade people by thinking you're brilliant.
Yes, and by telling them that you are.
Hey, can you can you tweet that out? Well, this kind of ties into something that I was thinking of when you mentioned sort of the libertarians who want to kind of throw out some of the morality and some of those cultural norms. And I think that's one of the best things that Dave does. Is that he just did it a couple days ago, but every once in a while he just like draws a line in the sand and he's just like, hey, just to let you guys know. For instance, a few days ago, Christian conservatives and cultural conservatives, they are way more compatible with libertarian society, libertarian ideas, libertarianism, than any of this other goofy stuff that's out there. And I just wanted to let you know that. And then, of course, the roaches, which is great to watch, because you can just be there with Ray. Someone needs to just be there with Ray. But it's a very important thing. And the other thing that he does that's great, and this is like tying into what you're talking about, embodying, having people actually embody these things, is when every once in a while he just pops out and just talks about how important family is, how important it is to be a good man, a good husband, and a good father. If all he ever did was sort of, kind of talk to these poor fatherless bastards who love him, pot, kettle, and told them that they just need to be good men and good husbands and good fathers. I mean, that would really be enough. And so how I kind of see, and I'm zooming out in the middle of a thing where we weren't really zooming out, I don't think, but sort of.
I'm always down to zoom out.
Dave doing that, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So let's zoom. You got Yarvin, who's, long story short, is just like, hey, there's a lot going on here, and probably if you fit in ideologically with these people that are going to be called dissidents, which if you're, you do, there's not a whole lot you can really do about it to change it. And most of the things, if you're looking for something to do, you're probably not at the level that you're going to do anything other than fuel it and make things worse. So there's that. Okay, cool. Then you got someone like Vin who's telling you to build the ark. All right, fair enough. We'll take that for what it is.
Very compatible messages, by the way.
Yeah, I know. I really,
which
is
really ironic.
Can take all of them and put them together. Right, it is ironic. It's a spiritual problem. It's not a materials problem. Okay, cycle is unavoidable. Yep, can't do it. We're back to can't do anything about it. Whatever. We've got to ride it out. And then you got Stapleton who's telling you basically get your bags up and you got to be ready to go anywhere because things are very unstable. Again, you can't really do anything about it. And then, you got Dave with the cultural message. And, by the way, you might have a bunch more allies. And this kind of ties into too. You have a bunch more allies than you might think that you do. Maybe stop making fun of them all the time. Half the population, because they're right there with you in a lot of ways, on a lot of the important ways too. So for example, a couple days ago, I saw a meme, about, it was a libertarian meme. This is how close society is to realizing that they're, that everyone in the government's criminals. It's like, there's half the population that thinks that, has known that ever since, growing up, I knew, people that had integrated that and just accepted that, but they've got lives to live. They got family to feed, kids to raise, all that. They know the deal and are probably very much in alignment with libertarian principles, where they matter. And then we zoom out, we look at all this stuff. Okay, I gotta take care of myself, get my freedom, be able to go wherever I gotta go. I gotta be a good man, take care of my family. Oh, I got more people that I'm allied with than I might think. So where am I going to do this? And those here like, hey, how you doing? Welcome to Bay County. Right. So even if whatever is happening in Florida, even if it's a dog fight, or even if it's only temporary, it's just like where am I going to build my ark? Where am I going to get wealth, power, and influence? Where am I going to raise my family, be a good man, and all this stuff? We're limited into the physical world. So there's someone who's doing the work here to provide a space for that. And so that's why look in the chat right now, it's all Texas, Florida, Florida, Texas, Florida, Texas. And, there's people who can't go to Saipan, for example. It's like, there anything, all right, what about anything in between here in Saipan? How's Hawaii? No good? Okay, well, what do we got? And then Florida's on the short list, which, by the way, if you're in the chat and you've got this, you've got said short list of in and out of the country places, yeah, let's get going with that. But yeah, that's where I see so fitting into this whole super zoomed out sort of thing that we just did right here. And it's important stuff.
Yeah, you can't retreat from every front at the same time. Mm-hmm. There's some fronts that you have to hold, and there's a specific way in which you can hold, and then begin advancing. But you have to be really smart about it. You can't. There is no part of any of this strategy that is ever consistent with a really big, loud, flamboyant national campaign built around messaging. There's no room for that whatsoever. It's not just that doesn't promote the goals. It actually works against it. It actually compromises the efforts, because now you're attracting the eye of Sauron. Now anybody who's associated with you is going to get dragged into this spotlight that you're pulling onto yourself. Mm-hmm. So you're making life harder on people who want to try to win things at the local level, operate on a local basis. You're making things harder for them, and you're doing things like the Mises Caucus did in Texas, where they're saying to not vote on this thing. This thing about secession, for people who don't know, there's a referendum basically about getting secession put onto a ballot, or it was something like that. So it's like a procedural thing related to advancing the cause of secession. And the Mises Caucus sent out an email to all their members that said, just so you know, if you vote in this, it will register you for the GOP, and you'll be ineligible to be a delegate for the LP. And so don't vote on this. No matter, even though we support the goals, don't vote on it. So first of all, this is a fantastic example of Purnell's iron law of bureaucracy, where now the organization is working for the goals, is working for the sake of the organization rather than the goals of the organization. But then the justification that they gave to it is they're like, well, if we pull a couple hundred people away from that cause, it's not really going to change the outcome of that cause, but a couple hundred people will make a big difference for our cause. Okay, so now you've admitted that you recognize the vast difference in influence here. But then even further, they went even further and they said that the cause of trying to advance secession, well, that's just going to fail anyways, because there's not enough political will for it. So what is it? Is it that there's this big bunch of political will that you're ready to capitalize on, that you're ready to have this big national campaign and scoop up all this political will that's all just waiting for you to come present your message to them? Or is it there isn't enough demand for this message at all? And what are we doing here? I don't understand the complete disconnect there. But this kind of will segue into a question I was going to ask you, which was, you feel free to respond to anything that I just said. And then what would you say, based on what you've read recently, if Mises was alive today, what would he say about the Mises Caucus? Leaving aside the fact that he's a gentleman and he would be a gentleman. Like if you could get him on like a hot mic when he thinks nobody's listening, what would he say about the Mises Caucus and the goals of the Mises Caucus?
Well, I don't think he'd be a member. Let me just put it that way.
There you go.
And you can see this. I mean, if you want to look through his political career in Austria, when given the choice between sitting on the sidelines or going with a party that could oppose the socialists and the Nazis, I mean, he did not sit on the sidelines. He got involved with another Austrian party down there, though it was able to get in power, and he didn't take the easy way out. Because Rothbard, and I think Rothbard as well would not have been involved, even though he was a lot more libertarian. I think Rothbard would have been a lot more interested in the whole building up your own caucus and things like that. But Mises would have been, for one, Mises would understand right now who the enemy is, and I think that's one of the things that's very overlooked in his work, and this plays out a lot because he focuses a great deal on the way that language is weaponized. And so there's this really fascinating talk that he gave at Mont Pelerin in the early meetings, I believe, where he talks about the reason why the success of Nazi policies in Germany was not the result of an election, but it was a result of decades prior where the language and the ideas of the Nazis had become normalized within the intellectual outlets of Germany, so that your average German was speaking in ways that had already had built-in political calculations within it. And this is exactly what the left is doing now, right? Like this is this is why they want to change, talking about gender in certain ways. They want to make you leapfrog. They are changing. The English language hasn't changed, but the dialect, the words being used, it's changing the language, and within that language has pre-baked in political issues, right? And there's icons to go with it, right? I had a conversation with a friend recently about a gay pride flag. And he was trying to understand why I'd have an issue with a gay pride flag. Because, you support gay rights, right? It's like, well, this is not a politically neutral symbol, right? There's a baked-in agenda, very hostile, within it, and we can ignore it, or we can take for what it is. And so he would recognize those cultural aspects of the environment as being the far greater. That's what's going to lead to the policy we have now. And of course, and we've seen this arise perfectly, right? I mean, Australia is exactly what you would get, from a progressive totalitarian state, and it's because of the gradual acceptance of these ideas, and they're now playing themselves out in enforcement. No matter what the legal system was prior, no matter what the laws of the land are, you're living in a nanny public health state, and so that's where they win. And so I think Mises would understand, okay, that's where the battle is. Like, he would very much be a cultural warrior on this. He was not apathetic to cultural issues. He has this great line where he talks about how it would be, he really didn't care if women voted or not, because ultimately all women would be married anyway for the most part, and they're going to vote the way their husbands want. So again, he couldn't even grasp this sort of stuff, right? When he's talking about these things, writing, at his time and period and the place that the world, he's writing within that culture, and that is part of everything. He's part of all those ideas here. To the point, generally, just this one quick point about the LP Mises Caucus stuff. One thing I think is useful in this is separating itself, the messaging strategy from what I think is the real Liberty Party Mises Caucus strategy, which is the takeover, right? Because I think there's something to be said about, you can have effective messaging campaigns that can push an issue in the limelight or whatever. Every once in a while you see something break through, and it's one speaker giving a speech. I mean, again, this is a little bit different in the grand scheme of things, but Jon Stewart was able to change, I think, some funding things with 9/11 just by taking his microphone and being a very effective lobbyist on this, and he made politicians care about something he didn't care. So there's ways you can do this in the margins. The problem, of course, is the means for that. You could take all the money the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus does, just run a pure advertising campaign if that's what you want to do. That'd be one way of doing a messaging campaign. You could use politics by using the Republican Party the same way Ron Paul did. That'd be one way of doing an effective messaging campaign as a candidacy. The other side of it, though, is the Libertarian. The problem is that they're not interested in that because ultimately the LP part of the Mises Caucus matters. Because if the Mises Caucus wanted to make their impact greater, all they'd have to do is eliminate two letters. If you went from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus to simply being the nonpartisan Mises Caucus, that 90% of its stuff could go into dupey libertarian candidates. Fine, whatever. There's some cost to that in dealing with some races, but whatever. But just by taking those words off, the Mises Caucus going and endorsing a nonpartisan race with somebody who's a capital L libertarian, that's normal enough to hide that. If you have the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus coming and endorse it, you get the gigs up, right? And so you just simply took away those letters, then the Mises Caucus changing nothing else about the organization would be more effective. The problem, you can't do that because it undermines the goal of taking over the levers of the political machine. The problem is the political machine, that the party doesn't give you there's no value at all outside of helping the nomination battle, which again goes back to trying to use that particular microphone as a messaging campaign in politics, which again, as we identified, there's other ways of doing that. So again, that's my little topic there, is that again, even on their own basis, the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus strategy fails from the messaging side of it. It all comes down to the idea that you can make a third party viable, which is the problem with all capital L libertarian things, is that ultimately liberty will always be sidestepped for this duopoly. Third party will solve us sort of cure. And that is the most obviously stupid myth in a movement full of very stupid myths.
Well,
that was
so
beautiful.
I have a kind of a hot take on that, and basically what I'm here to tell you, Buster, is that both parties are the same. I like to say two wings of the same bird. So
yes.
Why don't you
I can't support the lesser evil because it's evil, No, but it's also lesser.
When I think about the political thing and why it bothers me, I don't know if this is applicable or not, but I was kind of thinking today. And I think all the intentions of messaging, can be good, but if you put yourself in that position where you are a third party that is trying to get, is incentivized to get more power, you end up performing to those incentives, just like when Matt referenced that ballot issue in Texas. And what I think people might not realize is that that can your intentions might not particularly matter if you start putting all this energy into this political system. And is this apt or not? But Walter White started selling meth to pay for his cancer, and by season 5, he's this ruthless drug dealer, and that was not at all his intention. And I know it's fiction, but I thought of that today, and he realized all of a sudden, it's break. What do you mean breakage? It's well, you gotta go have some people killed if you want people to respect it. You gotta hang someone out a window. It's he didn't want to do that, right, but he had to.
Incentives.
He had to pay for his cancer.
Incentives are a bitch. There was a really good point from Jared. I was on the Catholic Libertarian podcast last night and talked with Jared from Hopian.org. Absolutely fantastic conversation. We really, really had a good one. But one thing he pointed out was, he said, if the people who are getting involved with the LPMC, if every single one of them took all of their money and all of their political will and all of their political efforts and funneled it toward getting constitutional carry passed for all 50 states, they'd have it in 6 months, and they would have done significantly. Now, I don't buy. I'm not saying, well, that would solve it. That would be that's the silver bullet. But that's part of the problem, that the libertarian political efforts are looking for a silver bullet. That's why they have a problem with the DeSantis Florida thing, because they're like, oh, well, if the state is powerful enough to do this, then that means the state will be powerful enough. Oh, sure, yeah. So you're not going to be able to just come up with a one-size-fits-all solution and to dust your hands off and go on with your life. This is a perpetual problem. It's always going to exist. There's always going to be political power. It will always be pursued by bad people, and there will always be a demand for good people to take and use political power for good reasons.
And one of the problems is that there's a lot of, and this is not applied to Dave because Dave is willing to take cultural stands and like he's willing to be deal with things in a very serious way, but there are a lot of libertarian people that love to grift on this neither left or right sort of thing, and they so like it's like a Hannah Cox had like a tweet I was like last week or so where it's like, oh well, if we had secession, then golly gosh darn, as a libertarian, when I go in team blue or team red, they're all bad. And it's like, again, for one, like she doesn't believe that. Like, she doesn't really tweet. Like she doesn't really believe that, right? Like I mean, she's not like you have a preference in where you live, right away, and that's fine. But like what they want is, oh, both sides bad, so listen to me because we're going to ascend this thing, and your ego is going to be bigger. And it's like, no, like this, and again, that's kind of what keeps dragging everything back. And I think there is a danger. And again, and you see this where like it's the idea that, oh well, we can go and we can, when you're trying to make like DC or the regime more libertarian, right? That I think is where you get into that point that you were making earlier, Stephen, about putting too much energy into politics where it kind of like drags you down. Because like when you're trying to control the regime for liberal ways and so, and there's all sorts of battles that go on up there. There's nothing wrong with having a voice of dissent or something like that. But like Thomas Massey isn't there trying to become like Speaker of the House, Thomas Massey, right? And he's there to do his thing and be a likable nerd, and he's really really good at that role. And there's a lot of value in that role, right? But he's not trying to be a party leader at the national level to control everything. I think libertarianism is at its best when we think about it less from, say, a Rothbardian revolution and more as nationalistic, national liberation movements, right? And that's where and the great thing is that this is where we're seeing organically the mainstream right moving to, is the recognition that peaceful divorce is the best way of dealing with this. And so therefore what makes national politics, I think, relevant is purely the fact that the left is far more likely to result in a peaceful separation with the right in power than the left will allowing Texas to secede on its own right. Like we know which side is more imperialistic at heart. We know which side is more military, and the lengths that they will go to destroy their enemies. The left is very very good at that. And so the only degree to which I think national politics has a role is triggering owning the libs and triggering them in a way to get them to leave and go join off with Canada and Trudeau. That'd be great. But outside of that, I think the degree to which politics can play a role is normalizing a separation or kind of your national separation in your county level, in your state level, building on the energy of a Trump movement, or here in Florida, DeSantis movement, and pivoting that energy towards real solutions, and some of that can be, a concealed carry, or across the country or within your state. It can be going after, some of those pesky, licensing laws that libertarians love to talk about. It can be trying to change, the cryptocurrency, the anti-tax and all that sort of stuff. Again, like you can wield that. Changing cryptocurrency legislation. Like again, every single state should have a libertarian group trying to adjust the very boring laws so that every state is more like Wyoming. Because if it's more like Wyoming, you have states starting to buy Bitcoin as a safe reserve asset. Because rather than buying government debt, like Florida, you can buy American debt as a municipality or Israeli debt for political reasons, and it's kind of funny. But like I think the long term, but again, I think you can have an honest conversation with people beyond the Israel question in general. Would you rather have Bitcoin or government debt? I think you have a lot of kind of normie conservatives that want us to keep funding the Iron Dome, who would say no, like just on my balance sheet, I'd rather have Bitcoin than Israeli debt. And once you have states start buying that, then all of a sudden you have the two most important lobbyists in your pocket, your two senators. You flip the way these relationships are working. And again, all this can be done with very boring things, which are always, like, boring things usually cost less money, right? Yep. And like, so like there's that's where I think, again, like where I have found, and the only reason I've gotten so much more interested in kind of this vulgar aspect of politics is because of the way pure political outcomes have changed my life last 2 years. But there's I think so many opportunities within this moment to continue this sort of wave. And again, that's why it's always frustrating and discouraging when you see otherwise talented people that have so much to offer, and you know their heart's in the right place to this cause of trying to end this American regime or diminish it or try to limit your exposure to it. They take the very most minimal victories there. If you take those people and resources and you distort them to obviously bad ways, like that football coach who refuses to adopt a 21st century strategy and just keeps getting blown out, right? Like, it doesn't matter how hard the guys try to play next week, and that they're not going to win because the strategy's bad. That's why sometimes it's worth stepping on toes for people that you otherwise would greatly respect, because this battle is too important.
Why are you hating on Adam Gase so much?
I had a question. Adam Gase, and LPMC is the Adam Gase of libertarianism. I like that.
You mentioned like kind of taking energy and just pivoting it, I think you said. Do you have any particular first of all, I want to start off with everyone that's talking to you right now completely agree. We talked about it before the show, how free and how fair the most recent presidential election was. We were talking about that earlier. But I always thought that was such a huge opportunity where, like, half the country, so I know half the country doesn't vote. I know it's not 50% and everyone votes, but even just the people who align with the half the people that did vote who would have felt, I don't know, somehow disenfranchised by that election. I always thought that was there was such a big opportunity there, and so my exposure to libertarians, and it skews, how I talk about them, but it is basically at the time was Facebook and podcasts and stuff like that, and man, it didn't seem like anyone was tapping into that. Do you have in your energy pivoting experience? Do you have any insight on what could have happened or how it is that you do pivot energy?
Well, again, here in Bay County, the official position of the Republican Party is that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president, and we only refer to him as President-imposed Biden. And the great thing about that is that we had people get. A lot of support. Here locally, we had all these other rec chairmen come in, and again, just one little small piece of things. I mean, we're not, our tax rate hasn't changed because he's illegitimate, whatever. There's I think that dynamic, though, because again, this goes to a point of Mises. So he one of the reasons he supported democracy was not because he worshipped the majority opinion, but simply recognizing that all governments rely upon the perception of legitimacy. It doesn't matter if it's a king, doesn't matter if it's a president, it doesn't matter if it's a prime minister, whatever. Like the people are willing to be submissive to a regime if they believe the regime is legitimate, however you define that. And the beauty of not only the 2020 election that put it in hyperdrive of just modern politics is the collapsing perception of legitimacy of all the institutions. And again, the election just put it up over the top. And again, and you still to this day have 60-70% of Republicans, which brings you about 50 million people, recognize that they know in their hearts that the election was stolen from them. I mean, the number one issue in the Republican Party, motivating every county from Maine to Florida to California, whatever. Trump had the best victory in Florida that presidential candidates had in quite a while. We are still having debates here in the state about auditing our elected systems because there's such a lack of trust, and a great fear on what the left will do to hijack these elections. And again, and that right there is the biggest threat to the regime, because the regime depends. Again, this is not even the state. Like, if you actually understand the message there, the election was the ultimate opportunity here. And I think the best illustration, not to be too self-serving, but after the inauguration of Joe Biden, Rush Limbaugh himself read an article that I wrote that was Rothbardian. It was critical of Trump too. One of the lines I have in there is that the Jeffersonians were better than Jefferson, the Taftians were better than Taft, and the Trumpers were better than Trump, and highlighting all the ways that he missed opportunities to delegitimize the regime, but that ultimately his biggest gift is the election, because he's waking up conservative America to realize that they are enemies of this state, whether they want it to or not, whether they pledge allegiance to the flag or not. The actual ruling class is at war with them. And again, I think it was interesting there was a lot of politicians in DC, a lot of Republicans that thought November 3rd was the end of Trump and the Trump movement, and they were already pivoting. Kevin McCarthy was already pivoting, right? All these people were really already pivoting. And then January 6th happened. And then after January 6th, everyone's now absolutely convinced Trump was gone. Oh, can you see these images? Kevin McCarthy, oh, well, he was throwing Trumpers under the bus. Nancy Mace, whatever over in South Carolina, who ran her election because she was a Trumper. She was throwing Trumpers under the bus. And then members of Congress went back to their districts, and they expected to get pity and like, oh, golly gosh, darn, I'm sure glad you survived that Hugh Shaman. And instead, the message they got from the Republicans back home was, now you know we're serious. And that is the difference of this moment. And like that is what that election helped brew. And that is the opportunity that we should be trying to put upon, and not trying to act like, oh, those dumb Trumpers and those misguided leftists, oh, we're going to solve it with this great tax plan we got. So no, like they know who the enemy is. It's whether or not we want to join them. This
is some of the best stuff I've ever listened to. It's beautiful. What's amazing, what stands out in what you're saying is something that has been really, really starting to get my goat recently. And that is that libertarians do not have empathy for these people. They see these people as they'll even call them blood-soaked monsters. And they have this attitude of, if they're going to do anything with us, then they need to first repent of all their past wrongs. As they're the people with the political power. They're the ones who have the ability to throw their weight and support behind someone and do something with it. You need them. They don't need you. But you could become someone who they need. If you had compassion, if you had empathy for them, and if you recognize that these are people who need someone to protect them. They don't know how to protect themselves. They thought they had people protecting them, and they're learning that they don't have anybody protecting them. They're learning that they're on their own. They're up for sale, and you can step into that position and become their leader and lead them toward liberty.
No, I think you should make fun of them. Actually, I think you should make fun of them for
those sheep.
Yeah. Well, I think
never forgive them for 2012. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing when you're talking about, reading, even if you do read Mises, extracting kind of like the rules, but not really the spirit behind what's being written and being able to apply. I think when they look at Republicans or Trumpers or whatever, and they see them salute they just know their libertarian talking points about why the flag is bullshit. But what they can't kind of see that if they talk to most of these people, like when they're saluting the flag, they're saluting a lot of what they think the same spirit is, that would exist in 95% of like a libertarian, like a real libertarian's like ideal society. And it's just, a lot of them are just completely blind to that.
It's like, why do they love the Constitution? Like they love the Constitution, not because they really love the language used in, article, whatever. Like they love the Constitution because the Constitution to them represents freedom from government. Right? Now, again, the fact the Constitution doesn't work is neither here nor there. That icon is important to them because what it reflects is their pride of being a free human being.
Yes.
And so we can appreciate that, or we can mock them for believing in the Constitution.
I was actually just when you were talking about your last answer, I was going to actually ask, is that the biggest thing holding back, a lot of these like Trump supporters, or is it holding? Does it matter? Like, do they need to be convinced of the idea that hey, this thing really doesn't do what?
2012, that was it. And that's why I've always kind of been, for this very reason, I've always been very open to the Convention of States, because either it goes great and you get like the 16th Amendment repeal or something like that, right? You always have people like trying to oversell, like Mark Levin will sell books like, oh, we're going to change these 10 things. Like, dude, like, do you realize how difficult doing one thing would be? Like, neither here nor there. Other side of it, though, is that, George Soros is going to come in and we're going to repeal Citizens United and take away our gun rights, and we're going to usher in the Constitution, Agenda 21 or whatever, right? And I was always like, okay, bring it on. Because if George Soros did that, it's not like it'd be secret. It's not like people would, you know, have like amnesia and now believe this new George Soros changed constitution was what the founders signed on to. It's like people would say, no, fuck this. This has no saying on me. Like, hey, I'm completely disconnected to that. And then we'd break that line. We'd break that link, right? Because again, red America views themselves as being a product of 1776. Blue America hates the spirit of, they condemn the spirit of 1776, right? And ultimately, that's where these national lines really lie. And so, that is that dynamic. And so again, the more that, and the problem is you have a lot of libertarians that they want to kind of judge, all these historical figures, like, again, it goes back to the black hat, white hat, they want to go, actually, Andrew Jackson was a libertarian on Indians or whatever. And it's like, okay, fine, but like, he killed central banks, like, and like these, that again, you have to work in a respect for the people, because again, you need a strong nation for liberty to work, right? Social trust comes from believing in your community, and again, this goes into the larger, the Misesian, Rothbardian stuff of the separation of nation and state, and all these dynamics here. Again, these are the dynamics that Mises spends so much time in, and where Rothbard really revisits in the 90s after his more libertarian days. Because he recognizes that it is those nationality-driven cultural issues that end up creating so much of the governing society. Because ultimately, with a small government society to actually look like in a good way, you need self-governing people willing to, bring back the shopping cart, when you're done, right? A small government society without that is chaos and bloodshed and down. It was pre-Taliban Afghanistan. The bad old days of pre-Taliban Afghanistan, right? Like that's yeah. So that's again, it continues to be just a blind spot out there generally.
There's a fantastic irony that just struck me, that the left hates 1776 and the right loves it, and the right is like trying to re-embody it. When the actual spirit, this is something that Moldbug really red-pilled me on, that the actual spirit of 1776 in 1776 was much more leftist than anything else. That it was the typical American mythology is that the Russian Revolution and French Revolution were left-wing revolutions, but the 1776 was a right-wing revolution. Now you could get into the Constitution versus Articles, blah, 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 but ultimately this was the same spirit of leftist, that like Thomas Jefferson had more in common with Antifa than he did with the Mises Caucus. Yes. The one that when this hit me, his statement that the tree of liberty needs to be watered from time to time with the blood of patriots. I was like, you could take that and put Lenin's name after it, and most people would believe it.
Absolutely. I'm not a big Jefferson fan.
I'm not anymore.
There is an aspect. I do think that my one little pushback there is I think that one of the reasons that I think why liberalism kind of completely became a perverted mess in the 20th century was that we built in this myth of the American Revolution as being the ultimate byproduct of the Great Enlightenment, right? And that, and that itself is the crowning achievement of liberalism and yada yada yada, and therefore this is our heritage. But I think that if you a more careful, and I remember laughing at some of like the Christian revisionist sort of history stuff that Glenn Beck used to do, and I'm not going to endorse everything that the pastor he bring on believed in, but I think there is something to be said. I think we overplay the importance, which is going to have to be completely dismissive of it. We overplay the importance of the Great Enlightenment in the American Revolution, and at the expense of the Great Awakening. And I think that a lot of that there were pockets, again, not all, not trying to paint broad brushes, can you definitely, but John Edwards is, I think, as important as Thomas Jefferson in a lot of the revolutionary mood for a lot of people motivated to take up arms. And I think that is one of those aspects that is gravely underappreciated, because we've always been a secular nation, yada yada yada. That I think is something that if you want to look at why was the American experience with liberal revolution so much different than European counterparts, I think that Great Awakening here found that's why the best revolutionary war flag was an appeal to heaven, right? That's like you wouldn't have gotten that in the French Revolution, right? Appeal to reason, right? And that's I think that there is, I think, a slight difference there, but it is true though. I think that a modern day Thomas Jefferson would not be on the backs of your average Alabama with a pickup truck, right?
Right.
Like they would be they'd be much more perhaps Aaron Burr fans. I'm not sure, but
what's very interesting. There's a TV show called Outlander that that was kind of a guilty pleasure for my wife and I. Very, very good show. But the latter, I won't go into any spoilers for anyone who wants to see it. But the some of the latter seasons take place in the U.S. and this is like pre-Revolutionary War U.S., like 1760s. And what you end up getting is you have a bunch of relatively poor farmers and like guys that are doing like basic trades and stuff, and they're being taxed heavily, like egregiously, and they're rebelling against the tax. And they formed a rebellion. It was the Regulator. This is in North Carolina, I think. They were like the Regulator Rebellion, basically. And they were fighting back against the aristocracy there. The aristocracy, who were all the major, like I guess it'd be like the landed gentry, maybe. And they were the ones who were oppressing this lower class of serfs. What's interesting is, so I never really understood this part of history. So watching it in the show made me go actually read and study about what actually happened. And you had this side of people who were being egregiously taxed, and they rebelled against the people who later formed the central core of the revolution. They turned around and rebelled against the British. That was the social class that George Washington was a part of. It was the American aristocracy. So the Revolutionary War was ultimately the American aristocracy seizing power for themselves and casting out the previous the loyalists. That was a very interesting illustration of history for me to recognize that as the show builds them up as like these are the oppressive overlords, and it turns out, well, those end up being the patriots, right, who later fight for their freedom, and we have all this mythology that's built up around it. One thing real quick I wanted to say was we were talking earlier about Mises, and he understood the value of language and the effect of culture in driving political change. And I couldn't find this example. I was sitting here trying to find it while you were talking. I couldn't find it, but Moldbug uses something, I think he calls it like the German cat or something like that. And what he describes is that within Germany in like the late 1930s, you couldn't get away from the Nazi Party no matter where you went. It was everywhere. So it was like you wouldn't have a magazine about pets or about cats. You would have a magazine about the German cat. This propaganda was just baked into the society, and that's what's happened now. That's where libertarians don't even engage on this cultural front, this front of social heritage and all the stuff that you're talking about. They don't even engage on that front altogether, and that's really where the meal is made. By the time you get to the political system, you're just dealing with the consequences of everything that happened previous.
A magazine about German cats sounds a lot more interesting than a magazine giving the 5 best gender-neutral tattoos to give to your transgendered cat, which is what the current regime would give you. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think, and it permeates everything. And there's so much. And Mises identifies that a lot of the rejection to capitalism by a lot of cultural producers is precisely the fact that on the market, people, it transcends. You actually have to work to serve the customers rather than whatever your own kind of desires are. And so, like a lot of the people that end up pushing for kind of the control of wealth, like the reason why you tend to have so many artist types that are so attracted to these authoritarian states, and whether it's in the variety of different statist models out, statist, we've identified Mises as a statist, but the authoritarian models out there, Nazi Germany, Russian, American today. Average people might want bubblegum films rather than like the art piece that you guys want, or this great national thing, or women's Ghostbusters, right? And that's what drives them crazy. And so there's that the people never are nearly as much of the true believers as the ones actually controlling the rules of production. And so that's often kind of itself a sort of force of cultural content. Like trash TV often is kind of its own work of rebellion against these very carefully cultured things, which is why shit posting and 4chan and the sewers of the internet can turn out to be the most interesting intellectual environments from time to time.
Yeah, yeah. That was related to that, I guess, and kind of tangentially. I tweeted something earlier today, and I saw you liked it. It was Jared from Hopian.org. He tweeted something out related to Matt Gaetz, and watching that, I was just like, this is who, if you're talking about like a candidate for president, you have to be realistic about what that candidate's going to accomplish. So if you're going to be evaluating your candidate for how he would govern if he was in power, as according to like the mythology of the president, it's like, oh, the president has all this power, and so he's going to go and he's going to do X, Y, Z. If you're going to judge him on that basis, you're not judging him on the job that he's actually going to do. By him running for president, you're using him as a messaging apparatus, not for the sake of what it actually, the message it actually sends, but as a wedge for driving a wedge into the regime and just gumming up the works with the regime. And so someone like him is actually he's very charismatic, and he has a lot of big, like, alpha Chad energy. He's very much the type who's like going to grab his balls and tell you to suck his dick. Like that. He has that vibe.
I've done that. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether they're conscious of it or not. Women love that. Women can't get enough of that. They will tune in just to watch it as if it's like a car wreck. And being able to absorb the energy like that, to become to have a gravitational pull. If you can create a gravitational pull for the women in the culture, the men are going to follow naturally. They're going to have to respond to it and have to deal with it. So if people are talking about like who should be the presidential nominee for the Republicans, you need someone like a Matt Gaetz, not Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is he's very much kind of like a nerdy dad who has Chad energy to him. He's like, he's gonna cook a mean steak. He's kind of got that sort of vibe, and he's much more useful as the emperor of Florida. Right. That's where I would be really, really upset to see him leave and try to run for federal office, because that would be like the best thing that the regime could possibly have happen with him. He's much more of a thorn in their side as the emperor of Florida.
I can make a DeSantis Augustus sort of pitch, but that could be a tangent for another time. The Matt Gaetz thing, though, I agree entirely. And one of the great advantages is that not only is he just an entertaining sort of figure and he kind of pisses off the right people, so he has that sort of Trump phenomenon with him, but he's remarkably smart, and it's easy to forget that sometimes because of how slick he is with his performance. And like one of the best talks I've ever seen a politician give was his speech in Wyoming when he went there to go trigger Liz Cheney, and he outlined what the Republican Party could be. And his biggest thing is like, stop accepting corporate money, so you don't have a conflict of interest there with those people. Rely more on the grassroots sort of fundraising things, like the Marjorie Taylor Greene sort of strategy, what Gaetz had been strong with. Getting rid. He was making the anti-war pitches. He was making the anti-university pitches. Like he was hitting, that the Republican Party should not be governed based purely on seniority, but it should be based off what you're actually doing and things like that. And he articulated operationally what a Republican Party that functioned based on the sort of meritocratic ideas. It's like kind of conservatism at its best, rather than the bloated bureaucracy that it kind of is this Kevin McCarthy limp-wristed whatever it is now. And like if someone like him was ever able to get that sort of strategic placement, I think there'd be a lot of there's so much to learn. He's interesting. Last year he was very smart and who he endorsed in certain races. He won most of them, not all but one, but many. He's surrounding himself with good allies, and so you're starting to see that sort of bench build there. And
they've come for him a couple of times with heavy hitting.
The deep state, the sex trafficking thing was such a cynical ploy. Like literally, the report. I dove down in it, and it involves. Like, I mean, Matt Gaetz. I'm not going to say that he's a Boy Scout. Like he's friends with some scummy individuals. One of them, former friend, is a guy named Joel Greenberg, who's a tax collector down in Seminole County. First tax collector to collect Bitcoin. Weird fact there. But he ended up being a total sleazeball. He was like creating fake IDs for underage girls, whatever. Just engaging in like a really low level, just scumbag stuff.
What did he do that was problematic, though?
Yeah, and so he was under arrest for this, and he reached out to Roger Stone trying to get a pardon. And he's like, oh, well, Matt Gaetz is blowing me off, but like tell Daddy Trump that if he doesn't pardon me, I'm going to squeal on his boy Matt Gaetz, and it's going to be ugly. And then like 2 weeks later, Trump doesn't pardon him, and 2 weeks later, surprise, surprise, the FBI gets an anonymous witness that claims a joke that Matt Gaetz engaged in underage sex trafficking. Well, the person was Joel Ringberg, a guy whose entire resume would not be a credible witness, but it doesn't matter because they had that criminal complaint. They leaked that that complaint is not actual. They can't act on it. Like, it's not credible enough to act legally, but they then feed that to the press. The press then runs the stories, headlines, Matt Gaetz child sex trafficker. And now every time Matt Gaetz makes a tweet, you have all these NPCs you're talking about how Matt Gaetz likes 15-year-old girls and whatever. Yes, and it's like that. At one point, I think the Lincoln Project trying to make a thing there. It's like, dude, guys, like a little self-awareness. Yeah. But like that's the way this whole thing works, and so it's great because it's such an obvious illustration of how this smear campaign works in its variety of forms. But yeah, I mean, the Fed, they had to bring up the big guns, and there's also some additional weirdness there with like this Israeli as intelligence official trying to like extort his dad. Like, I just get into all sorts of interesting things there if you want to go down that road. But yeah, that's
and he just kind of floated through it.
Yeah,
that would have crushed most people.
Oh, yeah.
He just kind of through it, which means either he runs a lot deeper than he looks, like up here, or he has very powerful, wealthy backers.
Yeah. Not only did he get through, he got married. I mean, he got married since then, so he kept his house in order, in spite of all that. Yeah. And Mrs. Matt Gaetz is a very wealthy individual, right? Like, it's not like she needed the Gaetz money, right? Was willing to suck up and be a trophy wife. Like, no, like this was a powerful woman that decided to stay there, which again, I think goes to show this as well. So
yeah,
there's
that's really
interesting conversation in the chat going on about secession. So like, I would say that now is probably a terrible time for anyone to try secession if you were any red state, or anything could be confused with a red state. And so there's some talk about if Trump was in there, that would be a nice, he potentially would let states secede. And I'm just kind of wondering here, whoever red president would be, aren't they incentivized to not let gigantic red states secede? Or like how would that potentially work? Wouldn't if you had to kind of like think it out, wouldn't he be better suited to just driving blue states crazy to the point where it was their idea to break the country up and let them leave?
Right. No,
like, oh yeah, we're gonna let Texas secede. That's
I think particularly given the ideological bent of the imperial city as it stands right now, I think one of the things. So when you secession in the short term, I think is a deal breaker. But I do think one of those areas where that institutionally matter, right, is who controls the guns. And I think one of those areas of friction, and one of the things that the Democrats are recognizing is they have to take control of the military. And they're doing everything they can to purge the military of people that are willing to resist orders because of the Constitution, right? They're trying to purge they're actively trying to purge the military of patriots in the truest sense of the word, right?
How far back do you think that plan went? Because I had that realization as I was being bum rushed by a cop this summer. It literally hit me. But like the purpose of all the BLM stuff over the summer, I was wondering, was that intent? Did they know that they were going to be using this to sort of take over the police and military, which kind of seemed like the last, when Mulbug refers to them, I think he houses in the Red Empire. I think something along those. Was that the intent, or did they just see an opportunity at some point?
Timing wise, I'm not quite sure. I do think one of the most important articles that I've read out there, important might be an overstatement, but interesting articles out there, is by Glenn Greenwald, where he identifies that one of the larger aspects at play is the financial incentive of the military industrial complex in a post-war on terror world to follow along with the war on domestic terrorism front. And I'm not quite sure when, again, this is a 90s throwback in itself, right? So much of politics is these days, of highlighting the militia threat, the domestic extremist threat, and yada, yada, yada. But I think a lot of the explicit woke propaganda coincided with the September 6th stuff, or the January 6th stuff, and all that aspect of it, because I think that they see that as being the next big battleground going forward in a lot of ways. I think what's going to be interesting is the degree to which we see people leaving. I think the other side of it is, like, if and I could see this being something that would be a major red flag to you guys. I think what will be interesting is whether you have a organization along the lines of a Veterans for Trump sort of thing start really taking on kind of a life of its own, of people that have served in the deserts of the Middle East for the last 20 years, embarrassed at the current state of military leadership, and having that start organizing in ways that are interesting. I think that the one of the little trends that may not end up being a matter much, but something I think that we should be looking at is that we had that massive mobilization of state guard troops for the inauguration, which then led to some people picking them back. I think Desantis was the first governor to bring them back, that's exactly the sort of tension there you want. You now have state guard troops being used to fill school bus driver shortages in Massachusetts and other areas that they're looking at. You have them being used for the nursing things in New York. I think the more that you have states looking to use their own state guards in ways that are interesting within this sort of larger umbrella, I think can end up like DeSantis a couple months ago sent military and some things over to the border for, it was kind of a photo op, like, it's what's worth. We'll see if it follows up with some of the stuff that's going on there now. But if you start having red governors start actively using that as another tool in their chest, that can, I think, it makes this issue, I think, change in some interesting ways that I have no idea. It can probably end up in a bad way, but like that's where you kind of create some of these tensions there and potentials for conflicts that can just go to how quickly this whole thing could accelerate in ways that are really unfathomable, even for people like ourselves that think outside the box on these political things. Like the actual reality of what this looks like in 2021 and trying to or 2024 or whatever it looks like. It's going to be very. It is as terrifying as it is necessary. Bubbles have to pop at some point, but it's
like eventual. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
I can't. We can't push into like Tho Bishop's fan fiction of how DeSantis might use the military. Just for like 30 seconds.
I kept hoping for the Cuban thing that DeSantis would end up in his Navy garb on like some like rich donor's boat, like off the shores of Havana, like just a photo op, like that would have been a very get the Mossad, like the Israeli military that came in to help the condo tragedy down there, get them on the boat with DeSantis and kind of but unfortunately that never happened for makes for some good memes.
This is part of why I've been starting to try to communicate to people the importance of getting yourself to a let me put it this way: being very cognizant of the politics of your local region, in particular your sheriff.
Yes.
Because when if we start talking about worst case scenario type things, they're not going to happen everywhere.
Right.
Like right now, everyone's talking about Australia and everything bad that's happening in Australia, but I was listening last night to the conversation between on 2-Bit Podcast. He was talking to Mike Paul from Paul's of the Wall, and he's in Australia right now. But he said he's in Western Australia. He's out near Perth, and he's out like basically like in a kind of pretty rural location. And he said all that stuff that you're seeing, that's all over there. And there's nothing going on at all in Western Australia. So when the economic system collapses, it's not going to collapse everywhere. When the social fabric tears apart, it's not going to tear apart everywhere. there will probably be some kind of war, some sort of civil war of some type, but not everywhere is going to be fighting that war. There's going to be hotspots, and there's going to be places that are, maybe life gets more expensive or more inconvenient. You aren't able to travel as much, or there's things like that, but you're going to be a lot more insulated. And a lot of that is going to depend on the ideology of that local region and whether or not you have men of character in positions like your sheriff, your governor, your mayor, those kinds of spots. So if you aren't in a place like that right now, you need to be working on getting there. Amy and I we're driving to Texas this leaving next week, driving to Texas to go scope it out and figure out where exactly we're going to move to, because I have mixed feelings about Texas, because on one hand, it's like, well, yeah, it's Texas is Texas and is great, and there's lots of great things about it. On the other hand, I think that it's going to be the front lines. I think that there's going to be a concerted effort to bring Texas to its knees because of the symbolic value of doing that. And frankly, I would rather not be on the front lines. I want to take my family somewhere that's not that way. But right now, we don't have the intellectual, financial, or social capital to survive going out into the woods in Montana and trying to homestead. That's just not viable for us right now. We'd like to get to that point, but we can't now. So I'm placing community above proximity or like the specific location. And by community, I'm looking for high value people who are the types of people that you would want around if things went full Book of Eli. And then specifically the leadership in that local region and what their inclinations are. Because if it comes down to like enforcing mandates or enforcing passports or that sort of thing, the federal government can send force there. But if the local leadership has some spine, it's going to be relatively easy to resist that. And the nature of the regime is that it's going to go to the path of least resistance. Right. So there's going to be holdouts and pockets where, if you're able to proactively enough and firmly enough say, no, it's not going here, then those could end up being kind of some little oases in otherwise what's rapidly turning into a desert.
I just want you to know, though, he was 110% Team Texas. There was no hemming and hawing. He was moving to Texas tomorrow, and then now you're on the show, and he's trying to head a little bit. Florida Stevie Boy, which is almost. It was going to be Florida Stevie Boy. I decided GOP Stevie Boy, but I moved up here from West Palm Beach, and if I relocate anywhere, there's no doubt it's going to be anywhere but the Redneck Riviera.
There you go,
as you call it.
Yes.
Talking about owning language. That was something I was going to bring up earlier. You've owned the Redneck Riviera.
Well, it's funny. It's like that whole thing. That's kind of my take it back, because the Panhandle was known for that for such a long time, and then realtors didn't like it because they wanted to sell it to Yankees, sell property down here to Yankees and Californians, and so it's the Emerald Coast. Like, no, this is the Redneck Riviera. We're gonna keep it that way.
Hell yeah.
That's awesome.
But yeah, that's the thing though, and like, so one of the things that this is something I've talked a lot with local officials on here about. One of the things that we've got, again, there's plenty of issues here that I could that Bay County faces. But those executive positions that really are so important. Like, one of the things that it was a little thing several years ago that kind of started me down this path, I think, looking back at it, is that we had a new tax collector here. And when he took over from this little old lady that was running the thing for like 36 years and nothing ever changed, and it was always miserable. When this guy took over, I can now go in the DMV in and out 5 minutes. Like, it's incredible. Like, and like having that change of like, again, being used to, government's always going to suck because I'm a libertarian this way. It's like, no, like this guy, like literally just by his, because he was a smart guy, private background, he made it 5 minutes in and out. Now, I don't like the fact that I'm going there to pay taxes, don't get me wrong, but I'd much rather pay taxes in 5 minutes than an hour in 5 minutes. Our sheriff has been pretty, he was not enforcing lockdowns at the peak of things last year. And our supervisor of elections is the best out there. I mean, he has this whole double verification thing. He's there's no hanky panky going on here outside of elections, inherent to the political process generally. But that's why the best thing about the Redneck Riviera is you get all the great Desantis laws, but with the best parts of Southern culture with just a dash of surfer vibe on the beach side. So that's why. I think this is the best place to be, but I'm welcoming everyone. I think just the general movement towards voting with their feet in these things is something we should be celebrating. I'm still working on Clint. Still trying to make my pitch to Clint.
This is I hope this isn't too disjointed though, but there was an excerpt, and maybe it's from the same document, but written by Mises. And since you mentioned taxes, and you shared it with us in our little private chat there, and I tweeted it, and I was looking for a response from people to see what they thought about was written. Is there any chance that you could go through that?
Yeah.
And share it with some people. I buried the lead. I think by this point everyone knows we're talking about Mises in general, but it was. I wonder how many people, if left to their own devices, would have ever hazarded to guess that it was Mises.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of those things. Is that again? When Mises talks here about the tax system for what, again, in the post-World War II Austria could look like, he is not defending taxes as just this great economic good. He just, it's like, look, we've got a government. We're going to need some sort of government. We're going to have to collect taxes to fund that government, right? Taxes are a bad thing, but we have to wield it. And that's kind of his view of the state always, is that he views liberal wielding of state power to be so important, because it is a necessary evil. And so the question is, where does this necessary evil, what are the ends of this evil being used for? Is it the protection of property rights and order, or is it confiscation, whatever? And so, he was outlining, for one of the things I think is very interesting in this is one of the things he stresses is, and this kind of, this is actually very Dysantisian, I guess. He's anti-home rule throughout here, because his experience of because for one, when we're talking about local government, centralized government here, you're talking about, something more akin to a state in terms of size rather than the United States of America. I think that has some relevance as well. But he goes in like, the central government should be the main authority to collect things, because or else you're going to have all these little local governments that create all these extra taxes to drain away residents. And I see this play out all the time. Like there's all sorts of little funding mechanisms that local governments will kind of slide into things that people just don't pay attention to. People just don't typically pay attention to local politics the way they should. So he outlines some of these are the types of taxes levied. Number one, excise taxes for alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and tobacco products. So it supports a vice tax of some sort. Two, a sales tax, which applies exclusively to the transfer of goods and the receipts of purchases by the ultimate consumer. Now, this is actually kind of a fair tax sort of thing. This is not a value-added tax, but so Mises pro fair tax in that regard. He actually endorses a wage tax, which I think is a little surprising. Modeled out, but he's modeling it after a previously existing tax system, modeled after the social insurance tax. And then get some history there.
With the reason for that is there anything where he explicitly talks about drastic change versus?
One of the things he prioritizes is that what he's striving here is the simplicity of the tax system, and so here he's kind of building on some of the apparatuses that are already have already been in place
because
there.
It makes sense and it's easier.
Yeah, and so that's, and you see this throughout. So he has other things like, he doesn't like gambling, so there's a tax on lottery winnings and playing cards and whatever. But
cultural, sort of a cultural.
So he's willing, again, like he's willing to go there, and he has a moderate tax on net profits paid out to shareholders of stock companies. Maybe this is why at one point
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, Murray Rothbard at one point referred to Mises as a member of the non-socialist left. And perhaps that is a little bit of that playing out.
Was that shots fired?
No, it was playful. So this was in the 50s. This was before Rothbard had his left-wing stage, and we had Mises writing him letters trying to figure out what the hell Rothbard is doing because he's hanging out with a bunch of, Black Panthers and the like at that point.
Am I reading too much into that about is that trying to put the potentially recognizing that these people can become too powerful at all, or is that sort of a daydream I'm having right now, or?
I think that there's definitely a recognition that you have business interests that benefit from the cronyism of the state and have benefited from the cronyism of the state. But you know, so I think that's probably where the limits are there. I just think he's just kind of recognizing that you want to kind of create a system. You know, he recognizes that there needs to be, you can't just go from where Austria is now and just kind of shut everything off. Like he's trying to identify how do you keep the pension funds going, right? How do you keep all these things? You know, I think that's one thing I think that always where I do find myself pushing back against some of the accelerationist impulses of a lot of people, because I think that there's a blindness there on the sort of social chaos that would erupt if you just, for example, ended Social Security tomorrow, right? The amount of people who have become dependent upon or pension schemes and that sort of stuff. Like when you take away this economic security that people counting on, and so then you have to so you have to figure out, okay, how do we take care of these sort of systems? And so I think Mises just recognizes that, because again, this is meant to be, this is not him writing kind of just economic theory. This is him trying to apply it specifically to a period of peace and time, which I think kind of goes to some of his, you know, why he thinks theory and history is just as important as economic theory when you're doing this sort of stuff, because all sorts of variables going on there. So yeah, so that's you know, he's outlining, and there's interesting, so there's other little things where, you know, he's not in favor of getting rid of all licenses for like the production of guns and manufacturing. So he may not have been the biggest 3D printing guy. So, you know, but again, just some of these old school sort of you know, biases there. So, but again, like the Mises that is writing that is not the Mises that a lot of Mises caucus people would want to believe it to be, and he's certainly not the Mises that and the Andy Craig's the world would like you to believe we're all like he was just some progressive left-wing refugee that wanted to bring social justice to America. And if it wasn't for those racists down in Alabama, you know, that's.
Well, you have Mises. I mean, how many taxes are outlined there? I mean, it's more than one. So that's
so he's got there's 9 total.
9.
And
so you have.
But like one of them is the lottery winnings tax. The other one is the playing card stamp, and one's like high luxury automobiles. He's got a luxury tax in there for certain higher price automobiles. I don't know. That seems very oddly specific, but yeah, so that's
I actually did like that one quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, the point, like you said, he realized that you can't go from where Austria, in this case, was, you know, during the time that he's writing this, to his ideal of where he wanted to be. And so you have Mises writing about taxes, plural.
Right.
And to that end, you have this is just, you know, it was such a powerful thing when I watched it. But I think the big lesson, independent of anything that you were saying, is just like looking at the actions of Tho Bishop, who is a brilliant guy, well-read guy, obviously a well-written guy as well. You know, he's got Rush reading his stuff, and he's not making fun of people for the sake of exalting himself, you know, above them. He's not burying himself in theory. He's in a boat parade, screaming his head off.
Yes.
And I think there's so much there, you know, that you can take away from it. You know, in like pair it with Mises writing about taxes.
Well, I think again, we get so fixated on the finer details. We fail to appreciate. I mean, so much of this is. I mean, politics ultimately is about winning over the hearts of other people. I mean, I think about it. You know, what killed the Roman Republic? It was not anything Caesar did. It was not changing to laws, and it wasn't even Augustus. It was Mark Antony standing up in front of the crowd after intellectual Brutus bores them to death, and he talks about how much Caesar loves the people, and he rips them up to a frenzy and throws a bloody toga in the crowd, and it erupts into a mob, and it chases these people that had just agreed upon a legal truce. It forces them out of Rome and makes them enemies of the state and enemies of the people of Rome because of a speech, not because of a law, because of a speech. And that's the aspect of that. All of this, like, again, like, you know, the failure to disconnect. Let's go back to that disconnecting power from humans. Like, no, we are always governed by human beings, and the world is shaped by human beings. Those human beings are dictated. You know, their outcomes are guided by their own ideas, right? So that's where the ideas come involved. We can never ever lose sight of the human aspect for it. And there's a lot of people that I will be able to motivate here and get to trust me on, you know, my 15-point plan to win America, save America because of Austrian economics, right? They will trust me on the intellectual stuff if I can lead them on the intellectual stuff if they trust me as a man.
Yeah.
And they trust me as a man if I'm fighting their enemies, if I am sounding like one of them, if I have the same cares as they do, and I'm talking at their level, and if I'm having fun with them, which is the most important thing you can have in politics. And so that's what we're trying. So that's what I've been trying to live down here, and it's very exciting to see. The great thing is that because of that, I have a lot of people reading Mises Institute that would otherwise never be exposed to it. Right? They're willing to go down these deeper rabbit holes because they're like, oh, that guy kind of knows what he's talking about. I'll spend some time on it. And so that's where these two are complementary. I would be simple demagoguery is dangerous if it is coupled with bad ideas. That's why we need more demagogues with good ideas, right?
Exactly. Yes.
That's the solution to all this. And
libertarians will say that they're like, well, anybody, like political power will just corrupt anybody. Therefore, nobody should have political power. Okay, well, somebody's going to have political power.
Right.
So you're just telling on yourself. You're saying, I'm not qualified for that position because I will be corrupt. I know I'll be corrupt and I can see it as a reasonable outcome coming right away. But somebody's going to have political power. So is it going to be just evil people, or are there going to be good people who will strive to take that power? And those people are defined by the fact that they love the people that they're working with as much as they love the idea of liberty. If you're driven just by your love for liberty and you're like, yeah, screw the rest of you guys, like I'm just in it for how it'll improve my own life, then you're not going to ever be positioned such that you can understand how people are wired. And so then the great irony ends up being that if you aren't leading with your love for the people that you're trying to protect, then you won't get the liberty either.
So what you're saying is you didn't berate people into reading Mises Institute.
Right. Yeah. And it's not to debate me, you coward. Yeah.
I just have to fanboy out for a second. I just think this is just a Chad moment, but one of the first messages I sent to those was related, but said, do you have any mission statement regarding what you're trying to bring to the conversation or the work that you are doing? He replies, yes, comma, quotes, win, period.
That was just beautiful. One last thing. We got a Catholic Libertarian podcast quite a while ago. He asked this, but he was a $10 super chat. He said, ask Tho about the election of 1876.
Well, this actually goes perfect. That was a perfect lead up to this topic. So think about this right now. What are the villains that normal American is concerned about? There are villains, right? It's the FBI, it's the CIA, it's the local corporations, et cetera, right? One of the best ways of taking on this mantle of defender of the people is by taking on corruption and ideological enemies in powerful positions, right? Once upon a time, perhaps the greatest candidate to ever run for president ran on this very example. It was 1876. And it's a period of time that people don't think about a lot. People get so fixated about the Civil War and they fast forward to like Teddy Roosevelt in the Progressive Era. Think about 1876. You have a man in the White House who is like bizarro George Washington, right? He is the most famous general in the world. He is the conqueror of the South. He is the war hero that kept the Union together. And he's corrupt as hell. And I'm not going to say that George Washington did not, enrich himself with government deals, but like perception-wise, he was a lot classier about it. And so Grant keeps, people in his administration keep getting into corruption trouble. Because at the same time, not only do you have a situation where you have a war hero as president, you have federal troops occupying the dissident South. You also have the boom of the railroad industry, which is like the most corrupt industry in American history because it's all about land, political land grabs and things like that, right? And so the Republican Party is just mired in corruption. And so upright stands a champion. You have a man named Samuel Tilden who had a little bit of that class trader vibe because he was the richest man to ever run for president at the time. He was a railroad attorney, knew how the game was played. And he made a name for himself as being the man that took down the most powerful a political boss in the most corrupt city in America, New York City. He took down Boss Tweed and his entire operation, drove him out of the country. And so because of that, Uncle Sam becomes governor of New York. He's a Democrat. He himself is intellectually brilliant. He is a protege of Martin Van Buren, so you got some of that Jacksonian vibe to him. And so here you have just a wonderful human being who is a champion. He's just trying to fight bad government. And because of that, he might win as a Democrat at a time where, again, the Democratic South is under federal occupied control. And so then it gets to the night of the election, and he's running against Brother Behaves, who was an afterthought, won like the 8th ballot at the convention, which was only because the convention was held in Ohio, which he was governor of, the afterthought. He's a filler. Interesting guy, but a filler. So now they get out of the election. Everyone knows Sam Tilden's won. The leader of the Republican Party went to his hotel room with a bottle of whiskey and drank himself stupid. Then walks a guy that is trying to win favor, and he goes to the New York Times. The New York Times at the time is a partisan paper, and basically he says, "Oh, we can't report the election headlines yet." So the New York Times writes a story, "Election Uncertain," specifically, again, completely misrepresenting the thing, knowingly representing the thing for purely partisan reasons. Because the New York Times draws suspicion of the election, you listen to this, Grant, mobilizes federal troops that, again, are Republican troops that are occupying the ballot boxes in these southern states. They take control of the ballot boxes. Sam Tilden is down by 1 electoral vote. There's 4 states, like recent elections, 4 states in contention. Multiple times, Sam Tilden is given the opportunity to buy the real election results from these states. And Tilden, being the good man he is, says, "See, this is what they're trying to do. I'm running my entire campaign to clean America of this filth, to restore us on Republican values, and they want me to pay for what I've already won." He refused to do it. Well, they end up having Congress holds an election commission. The Democrats think they're smart. This is like evil mounts Republicans, Democrats, Supreme Court justices. They bribe a Supreme Court justice by making him the Democratic senator of Missouri. We've got this now taken care of. Well, the Republicans then pay him, so he recuses himself. Another Supreme Court justice comes in. Behind the scenes, they end up making a deal. Hayes gets the White House, and in exchange, the Democrats get federal troops removed from the South, the end of Reconstruction, and best of all, they get a Democrat appointed as Postmaster General. Because unfortunately for Sam Tilden, the majority of the Democrats in power did not really care about ending corruption in America. They simply wanted it to be their corruption. And the Postmaster General position was where all the spoils was at. And so because of that, they end up giving the election to Hayes, pretty widely seen now as completely illegitimate election. Because of that election, the Republican Party controls the White House for 24 straight years. And so all that is what builds up all of those corruptive powers. Again, at the same time, the railroad industry, all these, that is what sows the seeds. Eventually Cleveland, who himself is a protege of Tilden, he ends up winning. But there's enough damage done those 24 years of single party control. That is when any hope for restoring the republic went out the window. That is when. You could, again, people put the Civil War, and there's a lot of extravagances there, but you can always, you can dial back extravagances of war if you want to justify the Unionists, whatever, fine. That is when it became entirely corrupt, inherently corrupted. That is when democracy was completely taken off the table. And it's because of the New York Times, corrupt party leaders on both sides. And because of that, Sam Tilden, again, who was probably he was the perfect personification of Jefferson, Jackson. I mean, that American, my favorite parts of that American political tradition. I know I bashed on Jefferson earlier, but the good parts of it. He was the product of that election, and in the 20th century comes the Dark Age, and like that it's a period of history that is so fascinating. And one of the writers that has a book on this, it's great. It's Gore Vidal. He has a whole series of fictional novels on American history they call Narratives of Empire. But even though they're fictional, they're incredibly well researched, and so in many ways they're better histories and history books because it gives you kind of like a normal man perspective. Because you have the framing device of the reporter that's going off running to Mark Twain at a bar, and it's like here's how much these neighborhoods reeked of urine and things like that. Or you get that sort of perspective. And so he identifies different periods of history that he thinks led us to the empire that he identified in the 20th century. And so it starts off with Burr, which is a great book because it's the American Revolution as told from the perspective of American Satan. He's got Lincoln, which was not a PC book. It's got 1876, and then he goes on, like his later books actually focus on Hollywood and FDR, and it's all very interesting. But that election itself, I think, if you want to identify when the Republic died, it's the election of 1876 because of the New York Times.
Man, what a story.
It was bugging.
Fascinating parallel there between what happened then, and then if you kind of combine what happened to Ron Paul and what happened to Trump, if you kind of blend those into one event, you get basically the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's a lesson for the way that power functions and why, well, like why being principled isn't necessarily prudent in politics.
If he would have paid, if he would have paid one bribe, he would have had his position.
Right.
He should have.
And how much would have been changed just by that? I want to respond to one thing that someone said here. That said, demagogue. The problem is that demagogue's job is to appeal to the most people. Most people don't want good ideas; they want feel-good ideas. Reality's cold and scary. Demagogue's job isn't to appeal to the most people. It's the demagogue's job is to appeal to the right people. You need the right people, the people who have the most influence in their community. Your incentives need to be aligned with the people who have wealth, power, and influence within your community, because everybody else will follow them.
And I think this is why I am a big populist in the American standpoint, and why I think democracy. I think America suffers now not from democracy, but from too little democracy, which goes into the cathedral sort of aspects of the federal level. But the reason why American democracy has served better than most is precisely because of the power that the middle class has always had. And so typically, again, like the great political movements are precisely like the Virginia aristocracy overtaking the British aristocracy. Like that usually is often how it works. And that's much better than actually having a lot than Chavism in like Venezuela, right, where you actually have someone going to power by bribing up the peasant class. Like what you don't want is a peasant rebellion. Yes. You want a middle class rebellion. And that's what American democracy has provided. And that's what makes us different than other areas that don't have that sort of economic positioning there. And so that's why like the Jeffersonians, the Jacksonians, right? It was a populist working class democratic movement, but you also had a kind of restriction of the franchise. And I think that's one of the things that is interesting now. I think one of the things the left takes for granted, kind of going on what are the points that you just said, is that there's a big difference between going out there every 2 years and casting a vote, and then being politically active. And this is part of why they're trying to use social media and all that to evangelize and to try to make every 19-year-old girl into a foot soldier for whatever agenda is going on there, right? But a big part of this, when you start activating, like every person that was wearing a mask and then took off a mask before they were allowed to by the government, they become radicalized. And so what they're doing is they're activating a class of people who don't won't just vote against them, but actively hate them, and because they did harm to them. And that when you make being normal an act of rebellion, you change the scales there in a way. I think they've surrendered a whole lot of power, and they're so self-absorbed and culturally isolated they don't fully recognize it yet. And that's where that's one of the things that gives, like, I think the biggest white pill out there is that got a lot of very evil, powerful people, and we've always had a lot of evil, powerful people. I don't think we've had people this dumb and this culturally isolated in a very long time, and a lot of that has to do with the institutional rot of the Ivy League colleges and all these things that we can identify the way that this whatever this culture, all that cultural decay, it's popping up the decreased quality of the elites. And I think that those blind spots may end up being points for salvation later on.
And ultimately, populism isn't the end. Populism isn't the goal. It's a tool. It's a tool in the toolkit that you're using, along with anything else, to solve the existing problem that happens right in front of you. This is a liberal trope that you have to find your one thing. You have to find that one little tiny thing that you revolve your entire world around, and everything is with respect to that one single principle or value, and you're trying to bring the rest of the world into alignment with that one value. No, you use whatever will work, because ultimately you're judging yourself by your impact, not your intentions.
Right.
Man, this has been a absolutely fantastic conversation, and I feel like there's so many different directions we could go with it. But my parents are coming into town for a couple weeks, and I got to go pick them up from the airport, so I got to wrap here.
Great.
We will absolutely have to do part 2. Though Bishop.
Yeah, we'd love to.
Yeah,
and if when you're out there searching Panama City, you gotta come by. Just saw a townhome. I think it's $140,000 with a water view. We still got some opportunities down here. So.
The biggest thing for Florida for us is that Amy has some kind of a thing where if she gets bit by one mosquito, she breaks out into hives all over her whole body, and they'll last sometimes for several weeks or several months.
Yeah,
so
they don't have mosquitoes in Texas.
So we're that's one of the reasons why we're not super thrilled about Texas to begin with. But Florida would definitely be even more difficult to manage with that.
Definitely avoid the swamps.
Take a Benadryl, Amy. Okay, speaking of fantastic, I had a fantastic bit at the beginning of the show, and the long and short of it is that we are at war with a certain podcaster who I've never heard of, but some kind of Mormon Greek philosopher name I can't even remember at the time. And the bit was hilarious. Good way to start the show. And the long and short of it is we're trying to win. We're not trying to be number 2. So please, when you are in need of CBD products, even if you're not, even if you have friends who are, or you convince people to try them for whatever health benefits you have to make up, I don't care. They're great, but make something up and get your friends to go to palomaverdecbd.com and use promo code KING, save 25%. Not for any other reason other than we want to be the people who are in first place in this in this whole.
We want winners.
That's right. Winners win.
If I can make one pitch.
Yep.
After you get your CBD oil, we're having our fundraising drive. Look for people to donate $5 to the Mises Institute, celebrating his 140th birthday today. And so, if you like any of the content from today, and you have $5 to spare, Mises.org/$5. And best of all, it's a social media link, and so I can then show that Jeff Dice later on, like, see, through these podcasts actually is a good use of my time for the Institute. So yes. So Mises.org $5 if you have $5 to spare for the Mises Institute. That's my shilling right there.
Yeah, let's do that. And let's tweet that out and then retweet it on top of retweeting it. I think people got a kick out of this, so we will have to do part 2.
Do you have any other calls to action though? You want to direct to people at anything else?
No, not right now. I got to republish some more R stuff, but I've been kind of slacking on that lately. You can find me on Twitter at @ThoBishop, and this has been fun. Love to do it again.
Awesome.
All right, thanks, buddy. You can follow me on Twitter at RealKingPilled. Follow Steven at Messina Inc. And once again, you can you can join our subscribestar.com/KingPilled. We appreciate you guys. Make sure you share this episode, subscribe to the channel, and our episode posting may get some hiccups here over the next couple of weeks as we do this trip over to Texas and everything. We may end up having to skip a couple episodes, but I'll be in the process of trying to get more uploaded to the podcast. So you can get the show now on all the different podcatchers. It should be on everything. So we've got a few episodes uploaded there, and I'll keep working on getting some more, so you guys have some stuff to listen to and to tide yourselves over. So we appreciate all of you. Thanks for tuning in today. Thanks, though, for being here, and we'll talk to you guys later.